Shalom, shalom, friends. Blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of Un-Apologetics, the show where, the show where we are unapologetic about apologetics. And I am your host, CJ Cox. I am choking on myself. I apologize. Anyways, we got a very exciting show for you guys here today. I see we already have a semi-decent crowd here, about 8 people showing up already. I appreciate you guys tremendously. I think this is going to be a really good conversation. But I'm not going to jump into the details quite yet, just because I want to do some brief channel housekeeping so we can get right into it. So thing number one, want to remind you guys of debates coming up. Now, one of those debates I'm going to re-mention in just a second, because it just so happens that the person I'm debating is my guest today. But the first debate coming up is on May the 13th. I'll be on Standing for Truth's channel for the first time. And we are going to be debating with Micheal, the Canadian Atheist, who is my guest today, on the question as to whether or not the 10 Commandments are ethical. So that's going to be a very interesting conversation, I think. And that'll be this Thursday, May the 13th, at 1 p.m. my time, which is Mountain Time. That'll be 3 p.m. Eastern Time, which I think is what the majority of my watchers are on. Also, July the 1st on The Gospel Truth, I'll be appearing on that channel for the first time. We are going to debate Rob Rowe on the question, does the Bible teach a global or local flood? I will be taking the global position. He will be taking the local position. And we've actually had conversations with Rob Rowe on this channel if you want to get a little bit of a sneak peek into those. So that'll certainly be very interesting as well. Again, that is July the 1st. I don't remember the time off the top of my head, but I got some time to remind you guys of that. And everything else so far is actually pretty up in the air. So that's going to be basically it as far as channel housekeeping is concerned. I did just notice I forgot my prayer. So I'm going to go ahead and say a brief prayer before I actually make it awkward and have the atheist join me here in the room. So if you guys want to join me, I'd certainly appreciate you doing so. If not, thank you for being here anyways. And Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to make this video, Lord. I pray that you use me as a vessel of your will in this, Lord Jesus, to teach and to actually to bring some clarity to you, Lord, and to seek honesty and truth, Lord. I ask these things in Jesus Christ's holy name and give you the glory. Amen. All right, so here we are. We are going to go ahead and get right into this now. I'm in a little bit of a rushy mentality, I guess, just because I want to get straight to the conversation, actually. Shalom, and thank you for being here with us today, Micheal.
Thanks for having me, CJ. I think we have to stop meeting like this. People are going to start to talk. And, while I think you're a super nice guy, I'm happily married and I'm straight. So, sorry, I have to break that to you. But it's good to be here. I think we've had decent conversations so far. I'm very much looking forward to our little chat. I'm going to bring my angry face though on Thursday for our debate, which I don't think is going to be much of a debate. It's going to be a discussion. I think that I like actually what Lawrence Krauss said about debates. But, he said debates are just rhetorical devices. He said I much prefer having conversations with people, and I very much feel the same way. They're less adversarial. Mm-hmm. So that'll be fun. And it was funny because for everybody watching, this whole thing, what we're doing right now, came together very fast. I think it was just yesterday, or Saturday, pardon me, that CJ had reached out to me and said, hey, I want to talk about these things. There was a video that had gone out, and then the Raging Atheist had done like basically a comment video on it, and then CJ had gone back and done a comment on his comment, and so it was pretty interesting. And then and so now I'm here, not as a replacement or a mouthpiece, certainly, as CJ and I were saying just before the mics went live. These are just my opinions. They're like noses, and everybody has one, and these will be mine, and in no way reflective of anyone else for sure. And I look forward to it. I'm not even 100% sure all the little points we're going to be discussing. So you're going to get my knee-jerk gut punch reaction to everything we talk about. So if there's people in the live chat, hey, how are you?
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have, actually, let me acknowledge some people in the live chat while we're here, because we got a decent crowd today. We got Slam RN, Honesty Angel, Nicholas Proclaimer and Messiah, John Clark, Spartan Theology, Jamie Russell, Jeremy Martin. A lot of pretty solid names here. Jesus is Lord. Appreciate all you guys for being here with us today. And by the way, I forgot to mention, if anybody's interested, please do like, please do share, please hit that subscribe button. We'll remind you again at the end. I want to give my brief disclaimer on what Micheal just said, because it's definitely a very important thing. The beginning of this conversation was the Raging Atheist making a video and me making a video responding to his video. That's important to point out because obviously Micheal is not the Raging Atheist. And so even though we're going to discuss some of the same issues, right, because there are issues that very often, various atheists will still have, you have as the same issue, right? Like the Job story, the Jephthah story, some of the judgments in the Bible, stuff like that. We're not getting Knox responses here, right? If me and Knox do a conversation at some point in time, which I just so everybody is aware, I have not reached out to him at this point in time. I will. The thought occurred to me actually last night. And I think that it's probably a good idea, if he's interested. I don't know if he is interested. Me and Rage haven't been really friendly recently, but who knows? Maybe that could be squashed over a good solid hash it out. But nonetheless, the point is that should be happening at some point in the future. If it does happen in the future, when I say should, I mean as in like that would be a good idea, not we're working towards it. But nonetheless, the point there just being, we're discussing the same issues. I'm going to use the video as a foundation only, meaning that I'm going to use the issues that Rage brought up. He brought up Jephthah. I don't care what he said about Jephthah, but he brought up Jephthah. So, Micheal, what do you think about Jephthah? That kind of thing, right? And so as long as everybody's firmly aware, right, this is just, like it's a conversation starter, the video. It is not Michael's video. Right. It's not a video specifically endorsed by Micheal. In fact, the main reason for this video is actually a comment on my own channel where Micheal said he thought that and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it was that you thought that the response video I did was solid, but only from a certain perspective, and that if challenged from an outside perspective, namely yours, you thought it might have some issues. Is that correct?
Yeah. So basically, yeah, and that's a fair comment. The comment that I had put on, everybody can go back and read it. I'm pretty sure it's still just a public comment on the video. Yeah. Is that if you look at the video you did from a Christian worldview, it's a home run. I tried to put on my my theist glasses as I watched you talk about each of the points, and from a Christian perspective, trying to look at it through your eyes, because I know you're a fundamentalist Christian, all of your responses made perfect sense from that perspective. But that's not, but that's, I think fair to say that that's the Christian perspective from someone outside of that worldview. They're going to think it was garbage, right? Or may think it was garbage.
Right. Exactly. And so that comment, just so you guys know, is the real fruition or not fruition, but the real beginning of our conversation here today. Yeah. There's actually really one of two ways I guess we could go about this. If you have any specific criticisms that you wanted to air out first, we could go that route, or if we wanted to just sort of address the 8 points that Knock had brought up, because like I said, his arguments for them are his own, but the points themselves are pretty common points that are brought up. And if you don't agree with them, of course, we can just dismiss it, right?
Sure. Yeah. Just shoot, man. I am at your mercy.
For sure. So the first point, then we'll just go ahead and jump into that. So there was the question of Job, and I think Job is probably an interesting one. In fact, even an awful lot of theists have a pretty brutal struggle with the book of Job. So I think that that's a good one to jump off on. And I think it was a pretty solid idea for Rage to jump off on that one. Sure. Now, real briefly, before I move on to what I typically hear as the objection, I just want to make sure, is Job the kind of thing that you would bring up in objection as an atheist, right? The kind of thing that you would want to discuss?
It's in the repertoire. It isn't necessarily one of the first ones that I go for, because oddly enough, it's not nearly the worst. So it will be at times. It depends how. I think the last time I brought it up was probably with my father-in-law, who's a staunch Catholic, and we go back and forth a lot. We headbutt a lot, but it's pretty it's pretty amicable, and I'm going to drag him into the atheist camp, kicking and screaming. But I think that so yes. Bottom line, yes, I bring it up, not all the time though.
For sure. Well, and that means I guess we'd be able to have a good.
I'm familiar with the story, so
right. Sorry, I just saw a comment, and it's just a joke, but it says as a Canadian, does he affirm the ABC alphabet?
Oh,
that's funny.
I've never seen that before.
I bet, right? And it's probably right after there with the A after the sentences. Probably another one you never heard.
Anyway. And right about now, someone will be typing a boot.
Right.
And then right after that, someone will make a comment about maple syrup on everything. And then right after that, someone will make a comment about hockey, and beer, and those types of things. So, and I have to disappoint on all those because I'm that Canadian you've heard about. Hockey all of hockey could disappear forever, and it wouldn't impact my life at all. And I hate beer.
Well, I feel that though. Baseball is supposed to be our national pastime, and I really don't care, to be honest with you.
Yeah, lacrosse is supposed to be ours.
Actually, to be honest with you, lacrosse is quite a bit more exciting in my personal opinion. Not to derail though. Anyways, sorry. So, with the Job story, I want to go ahead and actually let you speak for yourself rather than bringing up the objection, since it's not one that you want to go as your go-to.
Sure.
So if you look at the story of Job, do you personally see problems, and what would those problems be? Like if you wanted to discuss something along those lines.
So yeah, it's a totally horrendous story where it's almost like two kids sitting in a playground, and Job is an ant, and one of them's got a magnifying glass, and the bigger, stronger kid tells the other kid, "Sure, you can do whatever you want to him." And now, of course, it doesn't affect him at first, right? They go after his family and his livestock and all that stuff first. But it's one of the reasons that it's so hard to reconcile from an atheist perspective, and one of the reasons why it's so clearly evil, is this God already knows the answer, right? He's omnipotent. Right. He already knows what's going to happen. And if again, so I think for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to be doing it somewhat as an internal critique. I'm going to accept that the Christian God of the Bible exists, and that all the various entities around it and in these stories, that the Bible's an accurate representation of what happened.
Okay.
So coming at it from that perspective, God's omnipotent. He already knows what's going to happen. He knew what was going to happen with Abraham and Isaac, and that still didn't make him happy. So he figured, let's do it again with Job. And so he knows the outcome already. And because the story's true, Satan knows the outcome too. He already knows that, that not everybody's gonna follow. And he's been looking at Job, probably Job's whole life and stuff like that. And so at least I think it's safe to assume that he is probably fairly convinced that Job isn't going to stray. Just the same as, he may have sat there with like a holy cow look on his face as Isaac is like coming down, or Abraham's coming down with the knife at Isaac. And then he, just at the last second, the angel comes in and says, JK, LOL, you don't actually have to do that. Because I already knew it was going to happen anyway. But I think one of the things that makes it the most horrendous for me is it was this way to prove a point that didn't need to be proved. Right? At least from my perspective, it didn't need to be proved. And God already knew the answer anyway.
And so I think that is a pretty good starting point there for the conversation. I want to just a little bit articulate some of what I think about the story, and then we'll sort of just, punch back and forth, I guess, for lack of a better term. Cool. But so when I examined the story of Job, there's a couple things that immediately stick out to me. One of the first things that immediately sticks out to me, and I'll admit that before I get to the fruition of my point, this will actually sound like an argument in your favor, but I do think it does end up arguing for mine. So, people, I guess, will just have to bear with me. But it's interesting. It appears from the story, at least, that Satan does not have his eye on Job at all. and that God actually brings his attention to Job. Hey, Satan, have you considered my servant Job? You know what I mean? Which might actually catch people off guard, because here's this person living their life peacefully and even righteously, who doesn't have any sort of people, looking their direction. And then it almost appears as if the deity is the one who causes evil to start looking their direction, right? And that immediately sticks out to me for a couple of reasons. The first reason is it proves that there is something at play here. There's a plan at play of some kind. And I think that can kind of be assumed with the all-knowing factor. But even if you weren't going to assume the all-knowing factor, it almost seems like there's scheming afoot. You know what I mean? This isn't just a bet per se. But it's more of it appears to me, at least, it's more of God actively planning something out and Satan almost being a pawn. The second thing I think that it kind of shows is there is a certain level of, I don't want to use the word confidence, but I think for the purpose of this conversation, I'm going to use the word confidence. Confidence implies a lack of knowing, which is why I don't want to use it, but just know, audience, that's not necessarily what I mean. Usually if you're confident in something, you don't know for a fact that something is going to happen the way that it's going to happen, but you have faith in it, something along those lines, right? At least that's my understanding of the word confident. That's not how I'm using it in this particular sense, though. I'm just using it to say the extreme surety, I guess. It displays to me an extreme confidence on God's part in Job, right? That Job is this person who just absolutely positively will not fall, period. You can do whatever you want. It will not happen. And both of those things, excuse me, I think are very important to understanding reason within the story. Because we know not only from the beginning of Job 1, but also from books outside of Job, such as Revelation and such as Deuteronomy and such as Daniel and so on and so forth, that the motif most commonly associated with God, even more so than things like father and shepherd and stuff like that, is judge. Not always evil, or not always judging of evil is what I mean. Sometimes it's judging mercifully and generously and stuff like that. But judge seems to be one of the big things. And when you look at Job, it's almost presented as a heavenly court case, if you will. Ha-Satan, or the accuser, right? Who I do believe is the same as Satan, but it's just to point out what the word means, right?
Sure.
Comes to the judge and starts to literally present prosecution against this Job character in this particular instance, right? And in a somewhat rigged court system, the judge starts to operate as the defense attorney for Job by saying, this evidence that you think doesn't exist, this lukewarm Christian that you think he is, or I guess in his case it would be Jew, right? But nonetheless, the evidence is there. He's been proved, and you have no case. And I guess my point then would be, because I don't want to rant too long, I want to give you opportunity to comment stuff. I don't see how, I know that God knows what Job will do. And I'll even go as far as to say that God even specifically goes out of his way to prove what he knows Job will do. But nobody else, including Job, knows what Job will do, right? And I think in order for that to have any sort of meaning, it does have to sort of be proved out. And I almost kind of see it as a beautiful story in a way, that your suffering can be not just senseless suffering, but actually a way to prove you out in this, this, whatever this is, this play, I guess you could call it, from God's perspective. What do you think about that?
It makes it way worse. So, I mean, it wasn't, I think what you said before, it wasn't an active plan, because he already knew, right? And maybe Satan didn't know. That's probably fair. But, to, like you said, in this rigged court system, it's a rigged court system, judge, jury, and executioner, or savior. Take your pick. But you better pick wisely or you're in trouble. And so it's, you said that he didn't have confidence, or he didn't have faith. He didn't need it. You have faith because you can't have absolute knowledge. Now, you can have knowledge from a philosophical perspective, like fallibilism, where you can have knowledge without having absolute certainty. That's fine, but you don't have and I think you would agree that it's not even possible for you to have the same type of certainty that God in the situation has.
Right.
He knows with 100% accurate foreknowledge exactly what's going to happen. And Job doesn't know. Sure, of course he doesn't know. He doesn't know what's coming. He doesn't know that and I'm trying to stay clean for your channel. He doesn't know about the storm that's about to be unleashed on him. How could he know?
Right.
And the fact that he stayed faithful according to the story, I think actually makes him better than God. Because he had when there's a God with 100% foreknowledge of what the outcome's already going to be, and he still subjects him to this, I think that puts him like morally at a rung beneath the subject that's even being tested. But that's just my opinion.
So one of the things that I would immediately like to ask in this situation is, so you have, say, a young Randy Moss, right? And just stick with the analogy for just a moment. And he's the freakish athlete that he is, right?
Sure.
So let's pretend in an alternate timeline, he just decides that he doesn't want to be an athlete, right? He was still born with the abilities that he was born with, because obviously you don't get to his specific level of talent without having some natural born talent, right?
Sure,
so he's still the great leaper, the great runner, the great catcher, all that kind of stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
But none of that actually is manifested in reality, right? In other words, it's useless and it means nothing at that point, right? Because he didn't actually manifest it.
Well, he hasn't used his abilities yet. Yeah, sure.
Right. So in a situation where you have the faithful here, right? In this case, Job,
mm-hmm.
and God is aware of the fact that he is the actual faithful. In fact, even dare I say, even the unbelievably faithful, because we see, even in the Bible itself, right? Peter and Thomas and Philip and Abraham and so many others who don't even have near the faith that Job has. But nonetheless, God knows that. Nobody else really knows that, and it hasn't manifested itself in reality. So what does it actually mean, right? Other than just the thought of God. And if, in this case, the accuser is to come up to God. Well, how do you know that this person isn't just, you're lukewarm, I just like everything that I like, and you happen to provide that to me, God, so thank you, kind of Christian, you know what I mean? You have no idea of knowing, and he could just be a fraud. And it almost seems to me like God saying, actually, not only do I know, but even he knows, and I've proved it out, and you have no case against him, kind of thing. It does seem almost like if he doesn't do that, isn't Job's faith almost moot and Satan seemingly having a point?
No, because it's simply that God could have looked at Satan and said, remember what happened with Abraham and Isaac? Basically the same thing's going to happen. He's going to go through with it if the angel doesn't stop him. And Job is going to be faithful. And I'm assuming that in this story, Satan also knows that God is essentially infallible and all-knowing. I think that's probably safe.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's true. I think honestly what I would say, because there is an interesting thing about that.
I don't want to try to add to the text, but it doesn't seem unreasonable that the angels and the demons and all that other stuff, they know. It seems fair to say that they certainly know more about God than we do, having been in his presence and all that other stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly true. I think the only caveat I would add is, have you ever met a person who is, they're atheist, but what they really are is somebody who has a firm belief in a God. They just really don't like him.
No, I've never met anyone like that.
So I've met that a lot, and I think that might be something that might be a little bit more as a result of growing up fundamentalist, because you grow up, people who still have that belief they've had since childhood, but they just really don't like it.
Yeah,
I always saw Satan kind of like those people, right? Where it was like you end up convincing yourself of things that are, at least in this case, they think they know, because I know I do want to respect some of what you say, right? But nonetheless,
I feel like that might be
otherwise kind of thing. But the point is,
that might be anthropomorphizing the devil a little bit. giving him, kind of assigning to him more human characteristics. And in that way, you might be adding to the text. Because it doesn't really, or at least I don't think it says anywhere, like, I don't think it gives those or assigns those attributes anywhere. I don't necessarily think you're out of line for thinking that they might be reasonable given the situation, but I'm not 100% convinced that it is fair to say, well, he probably has these attributes as well, because you're looking at him through your human eyes, not through, like, without the capacity to see him, again, assuming that all the stories are real, how he actually is. So that may be the case, but not necessarily.
Well, and fair enough. And so I guess to sort of, though, continue into the thing here, right?
Sure, yeah.
Obviously. So you were making a point, actually. You were the one, you were making a point. You actually asked me the question that you thought Satan was all knowing, and I derailed it. So my apologies.
No, I think that's, if he is all knowing, it just seems it is, again, from my perspective and in my opinion, the entire exercise is superfluous because the answer is already known. It just is. It just is. And so this unbelievable suffering, like, imagine for a second, you have this life and you're Job, and you watch, I think the Bible says that his cattle laid down and turned to dust. And then all of his daughters died and stuff like that. Like, and we've chatted before that you don't have any kids yet. But it's like, I can't imagine, having to watch my daughter, she's an adult now, but I can't imagine having to watch my daughter die. Especially if something that would be at this point, because Job doesn't know what's going on. Job doesn't know it's the puppet master doing all these things in the background. He's just like, WTF with my life. And so to have to watch my daughter die of something completely inexplicable, and he had multiple daughters, the unbelievable mental anguish that he would be going through just to prove this point for someone who already knows the answer to someone who already knows that God's all knowing. Well, if he tells me, it's probably, it's going to happen. I mean, everything else he has said is going to happen. So why would I think that this thing wouldn't happen because he said it? And so it just is over and above, like, I'm going to do this. And it wasn't even enough because, so then Satan goes back and says, well, yeah, I took all of his stuff away and made all of his things die and stuff. But, look, he's still okay. And then so he lets him afflict him as well with the boils and all these other things. And it's like, come on, the unbelievable anguish. And the fact that, like, again, assuming the stories are true. Yeah, Job's a more faithful man than I am, because I don't curse any, like, when something bad happens, I don't curse anything. I don't think there's anything there to curse. I'll say, like, just my luck or something like that. But it's virtually unfathomable. And again, it didn't need to be. It just didn't.
Yeah, and I guess so while I understand your sentiment, I guess it's sort of a matter of, in this particular case, just sort of, I guess, a disagreement, really, in that.
Sure.
And what I mean by that, because I know that obviously that's obvious, right? But what I mean more specifically is, I think I see just a lot more meaning, I guess, in the or necessity would probably be a better word.
Yeah, I don't see the necessity. But one interesting point I'd like to make, and more of it in form of a question. Do you believe that whatever God did, as written in the Bible, recorded, and whatever he does, that, and I'll try to take a line from an apologist that I once heard say this. Do you believe he does what he does with a moral justification that's perfectly suitable to him?
So moral justification
in terms of whatever it is. So he does X, Y, or Z, right? The affliction on Job,
okay.
The mental anguish on Abraham and Isaac, having, I'm going to have to kill my son. And like Christopher Hitchens said, but basically Abraham talking to his son, taking his son for a long and gloomy walk. And you're like, where's the sacrifice? And Abraham's like, don't worry, God will provide it. And he doesn't know, the poor schmuck doesn't know it's him that's going to be laid down. Right. And then the unbelievable anguish of Abraham walking up the hill, knowing all the time I'm going to have to kill my kid. And then, imagine the PTSD of the kid laying down there all tied up and the knife coming towards him just for the angel to say, meh, no, it's okay. When again, God already knew it. And so, but the point I'm trying to make is that, and the question I'm trying to ask is, do you think whatever God did / does, he has an adequate justification for doing it or did it that's acceptable to him?
Oh yeah, definitely. So I would definitely think that God has, not only does he have reasons that would be, acceptable to himself, but I also think that being that his nature is synonymous with what I would consider righteousness, I think that he always has just justifications, even if we may or may not actually get to know those. And in this particular example, and even actually, I think that it's interesting that you compare this to the Abraham Isaac example, because I also would. In that it is a example of what seems like absolutely unbelievable faith. Like, you go ask most Christians in the world, hey, God gives you a vision that says you need to sacrifice your kid, you're going to do it, and they're going to have like a really, really, really tough time answering the question, and they'll probably answer no, even if they do.
Even if I had the type of knowledge that, like, even if I had the knowledge we have the capacity to have, which is like from the philosophical, perspective, I would still say no. Even if I knew to the best of my possible ability that God was real, I still wouldn't do it. Because it's
and I think that kind of gets to a really solid place as to why I think this kind of thing is even necessary, I think. So I already pointed out how I think it does prove out Job, or in the case of the Abraham Isaac story, prove out Abraham.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's a very important thing for the purposes of, like I said, getting rid of just like eliminating the case of trying to, damn this person or say this person is a fake or a fraud or something like that, because now what God knows has been manifested in reality. Mm-hmm. But I also think there are other lessons that you end up seeing from that as a result of this proving out. Like, so for example, one of the lessons is just the fact that you will be proven out, right? So like, if you think about that as a Christian, right? And you struggle with whatever it is that you struggle with, or you maybe feel that, in fact, one struggle that's big for me is, even though I've had all the things that I've had in my life, I was born in the United States regardless. And I just don't know what it's like to live in the 14th century and potentially get clubbed over the head by Vikings. You know what I mean? It's just not something I've ever had to deal with. And so, I've often had to question whether or not I am a believer by convenience. Right, because of the fact that the worst of the lives in the United States are so much better than so much other lives, even currently in the world.
Sure, yeah, I wouldn't want to be guilty of committing the genetic fallacy, but I think it is overwhelmingly true that the majority of people have the same faith tradition as their parents, mostly because the parents as the caregivers are the ones that instruct, and also the time and the place, right? If you had been born in Afghanistan, you would not be Christian, right?
Well, and see,
people say, "Oh, that's a genetic fallacy. That's genetic fallacy." Well, okay, sure. It's also a fact.
See, and I think that is, and it's partially a fact. And what I mean by that is there is...
Well, you might be a Christian, but you'd also die a young Christian.
Well, right. And that's what I mean. Statistically speaking, it's much more likely, for sure. I almost think, though, when we're talking about like proving these people out, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things that what I find here in this Job story is almost proof that, no, if you truly are a believer, God will, even if it is, Asia Bibi just recently in Pakistan got arrested. She did manage to get out of the country, I believe. But nonetheless, she was arrested for just having the audacity to be a Christian. They, charged her with blasphemy, and they were going to kill her whole family and all this other terrible stuff. Right. And I could imagine being Asia Bibi, looking at the Job story and thinking to myself, okay, God is now actually proving, and just to be blunt with it, that Micheal is wrong, that I actually would keep this faith regardless. of where I was and when I was and stuff like that. And then somebody like myself might be able to look at not only Job, but also Asia Bibi and think, okay, if I truly do have this faith, even if I never get the opportunity to prove it in that way, God will prove me out somehow, right? And I can rest assured and confident because of Job's story. You know what I mean?
There will be people who will follow through, like who will have the courage of their convictions. That doesn't mean their convictions are correct, right? Like, okay, so under the envelope of this discussion, we were, taking, I was taking the position from the internal side that all these things are true, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we look at the Bible as a historical document of the things that happened only from the natural perspective, meaning that there was a guy named Job and he lived and stuff like that, but not the other supernatural stuff, the underpinnings behind that. But if we just look at the quote unquote natural things within the storybook, and there will be people that have the courage of their convictions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the convictions are true, right? All the people that drank the Kool-Aid in Jonestown, they were all convinced they were right. And if I asked you if you thought they were right, you would say no. And the same with David, and the same with David Koresh, and the same with all of the other, Looney Tunes, mass murdering, Charles Manson like leaders and stuff like that that have come, came before and will come after. It's there will be people that will have the courage of their convictions, but Asia Bibi or any of these other people doing these things doesn't reflect on whether I would do something or whether I wouldn't do something. One of the interesting things is that why wouldn't God come to someone like me and use me as this kind of vessel, right? It's like another one of those curiosities that there's, it's like the only people that are ever demonically possessed are people who believe. I've never heard, and there may be records of this. I'd be really curious to hear one. I've never heard of an atheist being possessed.
Well, I think there's a couple things to note there for sure. The first thing I would just specify, I don't think necessarily having the courage of your convictions is the same as what I'm saying per se. What I'm saying is simply that if you are if you are a Christian, the Bible is telling you that despite the different things we might see from you, God will keep you in the courage of your convictions. It doesn't necessarily mean that other people won't, right? It's more of a message to the Christian in particular. And I think the important thing to note there is that it's not saying that it's proving the religion to the world, right? As much as it really is proving God's confidence in you to you. You know what I mean?
That almost sounds like a No True Scotsman, where he'd be like, well, this person didn't follow through. And sorry for clarification, just so we're on the same page. When I say courage of their convictions, I mean that they would follow through. Not that they would have the strength, but they would actually follow through with A, B, C, X, Y, or Z, whatever this dictate or decree might be. But where I said it almost sounds like we're a No True Scotsman is that if the person doesn't follow through with it, well, because God will make sure that real Christians have the strength and follow through. So that person did it. Well, they obviously weren't a real Christian then. That it almost sounds like you're saying that, and I don't think you meant to.
Well, and I appreciate I don't think you meant to part, because I definitely didn't. And I think so. I can give an example that actually uses that in particular. So Peter was told specifically by Jesus he would deny Jesus thrice before the cock crew.
3 times. Yep.
And of course he did. And of course, in that situation, and in fact, I would even go as far as to say most Christians, regardless of time frame, today, the 1400s, the 300s, a lot of Christians would actually say, okay, so he's not a Christian. It's just that simple. He refused to take the penalty, and so he's not a Christian, right? Jesus apparently doesn't believe that. And as we see, if we read the continuation of the story, Peter, at least according to my terminology, of course, comes back home and ends up actually giving his life for Jesus, if church tradition is to be believed, which I think in those instances it probably is. The point just being that it appears that Peter, while at one point in time he was kind of a coward, which I'm not going to judge. I think I could possibly be a coward in that situation too. In the end, God still does prove him out. You see what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying, but that I'm not. I see what you're saying, and I understand why you would raise that comparison. The reason I don't think it's a fair comparison is because, again, according to the book, here's someone who saw all the things. That he even saw the miracles, right? He saw the things happen in Gethsemane with the ear and all that other stuff, right? So he had firsthand knowledge. I think, and again, this is me in complete speculation mode. But why he would, deny that is, because according to the story, basically, like, it's like, oh, I saw this guy, I saw him with the rabbi, with the preacher, I saw him with Jesus, and he's just scared, and he's like, not me, man. And so I would write that off as simply just mortal fear, right? And I think you hit the nail on the head, and are correct in saying that so many people, I can't speak for you, but me, like, if it was me and they had swords and all that other stuff, be like, yeah, I don't know that guy, because self-preservation is an unbelievably basic human instinct, right? What do I have to do to keep myself alive? So, but I'm not sure that that's a fair comparison, because you're talking about someone who had first person experience with this individual versus if he were to use you as a vessel, for example. You don't have any of that. You don't have the benefit of any of that.
Well,
So
and I will grant you that only just because I think it is important. I will unfortunately not be able to use any Bible examples, though, just because all the Bible examples would still have that experience. But there is a famous story from Fox's Book of Martyrs about a man who denied Christ to the magistrates when they had brought him to, and I don't think it was actually denying Christ. I think it was, he wanted to be, I'm even getting the story mixed up. I don't know if he was a Protestant being killed by Catholics or if he was a Christian being killed by non-Christians. So somebody in the chat maybe can even, fix that if you guys remember the story. But basically, he goes to the court and they have him do all, deny it and do the little blasphemy thing that they want him to do to prove that he's denied it and all that. And then he goes home. And then he actually comes back on his own free accord and says, hey, look, I lied to you guys. I don't actually deny this. And then when they executed him, he was so willing to be executed that they didn't even tie him down. They just lit him on fire, and he just stood there willingly. Right. Sure. Now, that story comes from Fox's Book of Martyrs, which is a generally reliable book of history, though some of the stories may or may not be exaggerated. I just want to point that out, just because.
Oh, sure. No, and I don't have a problem. I don't have a problem with saying, okay, that happened, right? But it's a non sequitur to say because someone died for the courage of their convictions, therefore the things they believed are true. Right.
And so that's why I want to point out that's not necessarily what I'm saying. What I'm saying is I think that what we see in the Job story is that if you are a person who is actually God's own, basically, right? If you are one of these believers,
sure.
You will have the courage of your convictions and you will be able to make it through. It's not necessarily that other people won't be able to make it through in their own struggles, right? They may or they may not. But it's saying that you in particular, as my children, my being God, right? I will make sure that you make it through. And I even have proof of that. I can show you with Job, right?
Sure.
Read the story and remember.
And I guess the last thing that I would say, and then we can move on to the next one because it's already like almost 45 minutes. We barely touched on one.
Yeah, sure.
But we can do that. This can be a multi-part series if that's what you want to do. But the last thing I would say is one of the kind of like in my experience has been one of the catch-alls for Christianity, right? And when something good happens, it's God's will. When something bad happens, he moves in mysterious ways. So whether or not, and I'm not saying this of you, but I have encountered Christians like this, that good, bad, or indifferent, when something happens, it's like the Swiss Army of excuses, right? Something good happened. God help me find my keys. Help me find a parking spot. I lost my job. We have to move. We have to sell our house and move into a bachelor apartment. Oh, God's testing me. He moves in mysterious ways. It's like one size fits all. I can find an excuse for anything. So I don't doubt and again, goes back to what I was saying before, like from the Christian perspective, because from your perspective, what you said makes total sense. But from my perspective, it's like, this is just a rhapsody on a theme. I've heard the same thing or something similar 1,000 times before from a million different people. Not to be too hyperbolic.
Right. And I think so. I do want to give some time to move on to at least to one other thing before we end the episode. So
just so you know, I'm not necessarily on a timeline. This is your thing.
Yeah.
I just wanted, it's like, if you want to discuss, like, we can keep going with this one, or we can dig into juicier stuff. Like, it's your thing, man.
Yeah, no, you're totally good. I was just going to say, because I did notice after actually you'd said something that we are pretty late into this, but I guess my sort of last point I would make on it is I do agree with you. There does tend to be some double talk a lot of times when it comes to Christians. I personally take the position that all things which occur happen, whether they're by his prescriptive or prescriptive, meaning he declared it, and I don't know what the other word is. I can't remember at the top of my head, but something that he allowed, right? Permissive, prescriptive or permissive. That's what it is.
Yeah, I've heard it listed as permissive and decretive.
Yeah, exactly.
Like I've heard, but I think I've heard. Oh, who was it? I forget now the name of the apologist that I heard. Decretive will versus permissive will, and I can't remember the name of the apologist I heard use those terms.
Yeah, and I think that the point that I was kind of making there is just to say that I do take the position that all things, whether they're one or the other, they are all in some sense God's will, because it doesn't make any sense to me that anything could happen within a story that was outside of the author's will. That's just irrational. It could potentially be something that is, like, for example, George Lucas clearly does not enjoy the Jedi genocide, right? Sure. But it's obviously within his will. It doesn't make any sense to say that it wasn't, right? That's ridiculous. And I would also say that while God does work in mysterious ways, I do think that very often those ways are made manifest in Scripture. Obviously, I think that, I have somewhat of an understanding of why the Job thing happens. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking. But that would just be to say, I think when I read some of these stories, because of that perspective, and because of the perspective that I believe that God is a righteous being and even an all-loving being, it does help with situations where I don't understand. For me to look at, for example, when I read Job for the first time as a 14, 15-year-old, to say, okay, but I do have trust in this being, and I know that he plans all things out in some way. Whether, again, prescriptive or permissive doesn't necessarily matter, but that they all have some level of planning involved here. And so it gives me like confidence to say, okay, this might be terrible now, but it might have a really beneficial point in the future, which I think, we've kind of been talking to Job one, but there's tons of other examples that I might potentially give.
Do you look at that? So like all things, right?
I would say all things. I wouldn't necessarily say that all things are going to have a discernible positive outcome, but yes, all things. And I'll give it just a brief example because it's horrifying, but it's also undeniable. No Holocaust means no Israel, right? That's a historical fact. 6 million Jews had to die in order for the Jews to go back home for the first time in 2,000 years. Now, one could argue that the Holocaust was not worth it, and that's fine. That's your argument, right? One might suspect that the overwhelming majority, at least of Israeli Jews, probably think that it was worth it, considering as many as died in the Holocaust now live in Israel. And they, and they're very happy about it. They're happy just the same way the Scots are happy about having their land, and the French are happy about having their land, and all that. You know what I mean? It's like we're home now. And again, that's a dispute. But what's not disputable is the horrifying thing led to the nation, and the nation would not have happened without the horrifying thing. You know what I mean? I
get it. And when God started the whole ball rolling, he already knew it was going to happen.
Well, and I do believe that is true. I do believe he has a sovereign foreknowledge of all things, and that all things are working together for the purposes of those who are called according to his purpose. Of course, that's a specific scriptural quote.
Well, I get it, and that's where myself, and I think in this point I would argue the majority of atheists
Mhm.
find that irreconcilable with the notion of 1 John 4, that's where it says God is love. Because it flies in the face of what love is, right? 1 Corinthians 13 defines love as kind and patient and not boastful, depending on what version you read, right?
Right.
But like the NASB, which is I think what a lot of people read because the language is easy. It says kind, patient, boastful, things like that. And so you have to you have to be prepared. This is not my argument originally, but you have to be prepared to say that's indiscriminate, well, not indiscriminate, but that pointed slaughter was kind, or it appears to me that there's a contradiction there. Because if 1 John 4 is correct in that God is love, and 1 Corinthians 13, the biblical definition of what love is being, kind, that's either you have to say the slaughter is kind in some universe, or that there might just be a contradiction there.
Well, I think it would only be a contradiction if and only if things, and that's why you do have to have the difference between a permissive and prescriptive kind of will. But actually, let's not even go there, because that could potentially be seen.
Yeah, Sorry, I did that. That's my fault that it would have gone down that tangent. So this is your thing. So pick another point, and we'll go with that.
Yeah, no, and you're totally fine. You're totally fine. I guess I was just going to just briefly say in a way, I think that is a conversation in and of itself, perhaps even a debate in and of itself.
We could do a whole thing on morality one day if you want.
Well, yeah, I mean, that would be good. And I even think doing a whole thing on love might be a good idea too, because love is an interesting sort of a beast that I think, there's good points to go around on all sides. Obviously, many people bring up the spanking child example, but you can even just use a grounding child example in that sense, but not even the point. The point is just it's an interesting conversation to have. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
So since we have already burned through 50 minutes, let's move on to at least one other topic, as you said. So the next one that he had provided there was, I think it was Hosea 13, if I'm not mistaken. It was the when God says that the pregnant women of Samaria would have their child ripped from them. And it is Hosea 13, actually.
Okay.
That was the second point that he had brought up. So it was point.
I know I've read it. I have read that. I've read the entirety of the Bible. It's been a long time since I breezed through Hosea, so I may need a little bit of a refresher.
So with that, just because that, well, actually, we'll do a brief memory jog, just because I'm even struggling with it a little bit. So I'll just go ahead and read the verse very briefly. Let me just pull it up.
It strikes me that it was something about basically the Sumerians being bad people, and they were like wiping out generations or something like that.
Yeah, so it's Samaria shall become desolate, for she hath rebelled against her God. They shall fall by the sword, their infants shall be dashed in pieces, and their women with child shall be ripped up. So that would be the verse in question there, I guess.
That's pretty brutal, man.
It is very brutal, actually. It is it's a tough passage to read, for sure.
Does that sound like something? Would you do that to someone you loved?
So, and that's a good question, actually, to kick the whole thing off, right? So
could you do that?
Me personally, no, I don't think I could. And there's a specific reason for that I think that is actually within Scripture itself. One interesting thing that we find in Abraham's life is that when it came to Sodom and Gomorrah, for example, he sits there and he pleads with God, well, if there's even 50 righteous, will you destroy 50, it? And 45 10, 5, and so on.
Yeah, all that stuff. Yep.
Yeah. And God, not only does he not chastise him for it, but Abraham is one of God's beloved, right? More so than a lot of other people, in the sense that he's like the father of faith, the first of the Israelites, all that other kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. That to me indicates that God actually expects me as the believer to advocate for the sinner, because I am also the sinner, and to potentially give as much time as possible, or ask for as much time as possible for them. And so to to sort of, I guess, make that a straightforward sentence, right?
Okay.
What
no, I
God
understand.
may do.
Yeah, I understand. So okay, so let's look at so they basically Sumeria bad. Let's cleanse Sumeria. And again, it seemed the first thing, and I don't mean to be so tongue in cheek, but it comes across as an unbelievable lack of creativity. Just go in there and slice everybody to pieces. There are other atheist / agnostic apologists online who have said, and so again, I'm not trying to claim this argument as my own. There are other atheists and again agnostics who have said that that God could have removed the souls from them, right, and just made it painless, or could have said, okay, we're all the people like the story in First Samuel about the Amalekites, right? So that's a bad example because it's a different context. But so let's take all these people here, and so if the people have been evil and bad and stuff like that, then okay, maybe coming from the Christian perspective, we need to righteously judge them. But the babies, especially like in utero, so the fetuses, they don't have. I mean, unless you want to go with the federal headship thing and that they're guilty of original sin just because Adam and Eve. Okay, but they're being then judged and executed for something they didn't even do. So it's just kind of like you're guilty because why? Because. And so again, lack of creativity because it didn't have to be as barbaric as it was according to the story, and it's also just kind of like, it's like, so there's a bully, right? And the bully, picks on this one kid. And then when the kid grows up and he grows up to be bigger than the bully, he goes and he beats up the bully. Then he goes and beats up the bully's whole family just because. That's the way it kind of seems to me to be like equal to it, because it didn't have to be that way. And these are some of the stumbling blocks that some atheists, I don't want to speak for everybody, and it's one specifically that I come across is I'm not omnipotent. I'm not even that smart. And I can come up with better ways to do things than this God who created, apparently, farted everything into existence. And so I think at minimum, it deserves, an indictment for unneeded cruelty. So your picture went away. I'm not sure if you're still there.
Yeah, voice is still here. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll get that fixed here in just a second.
No worries.
So in response to that, right? So there's a couple things that I think I would want to point out. So the first thing is shoot, sorry, I got a little distracted while I'm trying to do. Anyways, so the first point I would say is, what is your personal belief on punishment? So there are three basic theories of punishment: deterrence theory, rehabilitation theory, and punitive theory, right? What would you take?
I don't think it's as simple as ABC. Like, I'll take behind what is behind door number one, Pat. I don't think it's quite that simple. I think it has to be a measure of punitive and rehabilitative. I am not a proponent of the death penalty for a couple of reasons. One, it's been documented that there have been people that have been executed wrongly and later would have been exonerated. So that's a problem. We also know it's not a deterrent. I mean, look at how many places in the United States still have the death penalty. The murder rates are still crazy high. So we know it doesn't stop people from doing it if they're hell bent on doing it. And I also see it as cruel and unusual. The death penalty is really weird, man, because it tugs at your emotions a lot, right? What if it was your insert, wife, child, friend, blah, blah, blah. Wouldn't you want to see it then? Well, of course. You start to see it and you get angry and you think, I want retribution. But that's why the victims of the family aren't the ones that are doing the prosecuting, right? Or aren't the judge and aren't the jury, because they realize they can't be objective about the whole thing. But to most directly answer your question, it's a combination of punitive and rehabilitative.
So, and we would agree on the punitive part. I don't necessarily see it as rehabilitative in a sense. I've always seen that, I don't know, personal opinion, so we won't go too deep into it, but it does seem to me like punishment doesn't work for rehabilitation as much as excuse me, again, sorry, I'm choking on coffee. I choked on spit to begin this, now I'm choking on coffee now. It's ridiculous.
There you go.
Anyways, that it doesn't seem to work very well for rehabilitation, but like things like mercy and teaching do. So like as a perfect example, like drugs, it doesn't seem to me to work to put people in prison when they're druggies. They just kind of go back to being druggies. It doesn't work 100% or even 50% of the time, but it's like 4 or 5 times as well when you put them in like drug classes or something along those lines, right? It's still only I don't
know any statistics on that. I wouldn't want to guess, because that's all it would be. I agree with you in that, stuff like but I mean, marijuana is decriminalized in Canada, so it's a slightly different animal here. And I use it as much now as I did before it was decriminalized, which is to say none. I've never used it. But I agree with you from a certain perspective now, but I also think that there does have to be that punitive thing. Like if you break the law, if you go against the societal mores and things like that and taboos that have been set in place, that there should be a penalty for that. And at the same time, and that's why I said it's not as simple as door 1, 2, or 3, in that It has to be done. It has to be done in conjunction. So the punitive aspect, and at the same time, the other things, like whether it be classes or whether it be something else. And I'm also in favor of things, like while in jail, or in prison, whatever the terminology, whichever terminology is correct, rehabilitation in the form of education and things like that. Because the last thing you want to do is spit someone back out on the street with no more skills than they had X number of months, years ago before they went in there, because their prospects are just as good. And they're likely going to go back to the same thing. I think if society is going to impose these types of judgments and punishments on people, then they also accept a degree of responsibility for what happens once that person is served that time, to make sure that to safeguard in some way that they don't fall back into the same thing. Just like in the Bible, when it was talking about slavery, which is a big push button issue, that a master had to provide for the slave when they were leaving, so they didn't, or for the indentured servant and stuff like that, so they didn't fall back into poverty. Society should have to take that same responsibility, so that the person who had been punished and hopefully rehabilitated doesn't just go back to the same thing.
I appreciate that you actually noticed that, because a lot of atheists do refuse to notice that and of course, obviously, I assume you probably still agree with the whole, the fact that slavery is in the Bible at all. But it is nice for people to at least notice that they tried to kind of make it as ethical as they could.
I think that there's, and I think you know him as well. Dr. Josh Bowen wrote a book on this. Does the Bible endorse or the Old Testament endorse slavery? It absolutely does. He's got a great book on it. Go check it out. But there is a difference between, like, I accept that there's a difference between indentured servitude, and I'm not an expert like he is in this field, whether it's just the indentured servants had to be provided for, or whether the slaves did too. Slavery is still abhorrent, and it's a big deal. But I use it only as a frame of reference to say, like, even back then, there were situations where, like, we're gonna kind of set you up so everything doesn't fall apart again. So, and I think that we should be doing the same thing.
Well, and I don't know. I just, like I said, and I do actually appreciate it with Josh Bowen too, because he does. Although, I'll be honest, I think sometimes when he gets in debates, it kind of, to be fair, that's rhetorical, right? I'll do that too, but I don't want to turn it into something to trash on Josh Bowen.
I hope Josh is watching this. I sent him the link. He's amazing. Josh, I love you.
I think Josh is a very intelligent individual for sure, and I don't find him to be actually dishonest, but I do find him to have like certain things where he like, I feel like his agenda has gotten in the way. And of course, he'll probably think the same thing of me. So I'm sure that is not a terrible thing to say, but that's my own opinion, right?
Yeah, I respect it. You can have your own opinion, but Josh is one of the most. I actually said this to him, so just a little bit of a side story. When I first learned about him, I had sent him because I watched him on Skylar's channel a whole bunch, right? And he was this guy who was really struggling, and he was, who's now identifies as an atheist. If when you hear about his story and stuff like that, about how before he went to Hopkins, he said, I'm going to go win souls for Christ, and then just a very short time into his PhD program, he realized like, I can't do this anymore. And he talks at great length in different areas and in different videos about the personal struggle he went through, and about how, and I think if you ask him now, he would still say, I wish it was actually true, because he has said that there are aspects of his life that he liked so much better when he was a Christian, and I could actually believe this kind of stuff. I don't believe, and what I said to him when I was reaching out to him to try to get him to come on the podcast for the first time, he's since been on 3 more times, including just last week. But I said, I imagine if Jesus was a real guy, he would have been something like you. And then I hit the send button, and then I remember like, what did I just do? He's going to think I'm a nutcase. And we laughed about it later, because he is unbelievably, he is the most, and I've said this before, and before this turns into like a Josh, like wowing session, he's the most humble expert I've ever met. So.
Well, and like I said, I don't even disagree with that. And to be fair, I wasn't saying anything about him that I don't think he would also say about me, or that we would even say about each other, right? Which is just that people have agendas.
Yeah. Maybe.
But
yeah, I definitely have an agenda. Yeah,
right.
I don't even try to hide
it. However, though, so we did get a little derailed, and that's my fault. My apologies. But nonetheless, so we do agree at least somewhat. I think I would probably agree more so with this statement than you, but we do agree at least somewhat that punishment is punitive, right? Or at least it should be. Like there is a certain element.
Punishment by definition is punitive. Yeah.
Well, right, but not obviously that's true, but more so in that its point is to punish the wrong in a sense, right? Like if we have something that is only rehabilitating a rapist versus something that is only punishing a rapist, you would probably agree that the second one is more akin to what is actually in line with morality, right?
So, I repeat those two because I want to give you a clear answer.
Yeah, for sure. So if we had a penalty that was strictly rehabilitative for a rapist,
and
a penalty that was strictly punitive for a rapist, is it fair to say that the second one does have more of a seemingly a moral value than the first? In other words, the point isn't to rehabilitate the person; the point is actually to punish them.
So, if you force me to select either door A or door B, I would say that the punishment is more moral. However, I would go back to what I said before, and that it's more nuanced than that, and that there does have to be a form of rehabilitation in there, because it's like when you were a kid, and it's like when you were a kid and you asked your parents to do something, and they said no, and you said why, and you said because I said so. That was probably the least satisfying response you could possibly get, right? So if you have simply the punitive angle, say you did X, because you did X, you are going to be put in a steel box for Y number of years. Okay. It's probably not reasonable to expect a whole lot of that person when they get out after serving Y number of years. That's why you have to do, and I think that this is a failure, and the U.S. doesn't have the marketplace cornered on this. I think there are societies all over the planet that need to do this better about trying to rehabilitate. But again, and you brought up rape, right? Which is another really like that's a trigger issue because it's so violent, right? And it's like you can't. It's hard to think. There are times, and I've spoken to women about this, that I've spoken to women who have been the victims of rape, and they have one of them that sticks out of my mind said, "I wish he would have just killed me." That's how unbelievable a violation rape is. I mean, it's an incredibly, sticky issue. But I understand you going with that, and does have to be punishment for that. Absolutely, you need to lose your freedom for doing something as vile as that.
Right.
But we also need to address it, because one day you're going to go free again, because that's just the way the systems are set up in the world, and we want you to not do that again. So how do we do that? Because putting you in a box, and I think we agreed on this, probably wouldn't do it. Simply putting them in a box doesn't do it. The same as no, CJ, you can't have a cookie right now because I said so. Wouldn't do it when you were 4 years old.
Yeah, and I even would agree with that too. And I think so. The reason I did sort of play the force game, right, where I tried to okay, but if you had to A or B, right?
Yeah.
Is simply to say that there is something that seems like almost innate, and when I say almost innate, it's because it's almost ubiquitous beyond culture and time, even, right? Like, we don't always agree on what things need to be punished or the definition of things that need to be punished.
Sure.
But we do agree that there are certain things that need to be punished, and actually, very often we do agree on what those things are. We just don't agree on what those things define, right? Like, I always bring up the murder example, because every culture believes that murder is wrong. It's just that some cultures might not consider killing you to be murder. You know what I mean?
Sure, yeah. And it's interesting because, and this is where we see this. So this is so evident and has been evident throughout the process of evolution, because there are lots of other fellow animals, because we're just animals, apes, because we're just apes, ape societies that they don't put up with that garbage. They won't allow things like rape or stealing. They expel members of their tribe, for lack of a better term, for doing things like that. They ostracize them, and these are merely animals that do this. So it's like, yeah, we see this through, and that's one of the things that makes it so clear that morality is just an emergent process. Because we are certainly not alone in that. We are just the most vocal.
Well, and I hope you don't take offense to this, but I'll have to move on that just a little bit, move beyond that.
Yeah. I don't expect to get any agreement from you on that.
Well, right, for sure. But I just mean, just because, sorry, I'm just trying to rush to a point, and I apologize for that, because maybe I shouldn't even rush behind it, but nonetheless.
I'm just as guilty of derailing as you are. So
there is an ethical idea that is commonly called deontology, where there is this idea that you have set moral values and duties. It's in a way saying objectivity, right? But that these duties are binding is the biggest thing about deontology that makes it maybe a little bit different than just the idea of objective morality itself.
Sure.
In other words, deontology is by definition objective morality, but not all objective morality is by definition deontology, right?
I'm a moral realist, by the way. I believe there are moral facts.
I believe we have actually discussed this before on your channel, if I'm not mistaken. So the reason I bring that up is because under the Christian worldview, or really any theistic worldview for that matter, if the God is the moral arbiter, then of course that would be where the deon or duty comes from, right? I think it's actually deonto or something like that. But nonetheless, the point is the duty, right? Maybe I should just not try to sound more educated than I am. But the duty, so in this situation, you have certain duties and values that are set in stone that you absolutely must adhere to. One of them, seemingly, at least according to our own innate nature as humans, and even as you even pointed out, I would argue this even, from a theistic worldview, it doesn't necessarily surprise me that some animals like apes and wolves also have some behaviors kind of like this, right? It seems to me like justice is one of those innate duties and the Bible obviously outright says as much, but it also seems like from our moral intuition, we can even find that, right? So now, assuming the Bible is true for a moment, and that it aligns with our moral intuition, which I think, at least in that portion, we might even agree that it does. it seems to me like it would almost be a require now, and we'll get to the severity of it, obviously.
Sure.
But just the to get to the initial point of the judgment itself, right?
Mhm.
It almost seems like to me that a God would be inept if he refused to judge nations once they reached a certain level of moral depravity. Like that would be a judge not actually enacting justice. And not only does that contradict what I find in the Bible, it also contradicts what is seemingly the moral intuition of humans ubiquitously and even certain animal species. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. I almost agree with you, but it's an area of somewhat agreement and then massive disagreement, because I think that we have, and I'm wanting to tread very carefully because I don't want to start to touch on things you and I are discussing on Thursday. So it's hard for me to kind of dance around that, and I don't want it to seem like to anyone in the live chat that I'm trying to avoid it. But there really is a specific thing, and you'll just have to tune into Standing for Truth on Thursday to listen to more of it. But to say that God would be inept, okay, sure, maybe, assuming that the worldview is true, right? If we continue on with that presupposition that the worldview is true. But it doesn't have to be like the Bible says, where the wages of sin is death, right? Because so like one day when you have children, it will not be one size fits all for either rehabilitative or punitive when it comes to teaching and punishing in some instances your kids. It won't be you did the wrong thing. Where's my baseball bat? Right? You will do things like you will let the punishment fit the crime, right? So to speak. And the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible's like wages of sin are death. It's like real, it's super simple about the whole thing. And so God coming in and judging all these different nations, it's like, well, and so the one thing, right? Okay, so like adultery, right? And it was 7th commandment. 6, 7, or 8, one of those. But it's like, yeah, I believe adultery is wrong. I think it's wrong for different reasons than a kind of a mainstream Christian would, because I think it's a crappy thing to do to someone you're supposed to love. But I don't think that it's just, and I wouldn't see a God as inept if he didn't kill the person for doing that. And that's and I'm trying to sink my teeth into as much of your worldview as possible, and I can't reconcile that. Yeah, you cheated on the person, we got to kill you, right? But because I'm also not a form of capital punishment, I can't see that for anything, and it's hard because there are easy push button things to go to. Well, what about raping a child, or what about X, or what about Y? You can come up with horrific things that will poke you. In your poke you with the emotion stick and make you build up this feverish response. Yeah, in that instance, yeah, he's got to die, right? I don't think that, and it's hard. It's hard sometimes. I admit it. It's hard to separate those emotions, but I certainly, I guess I can't see the God as inept, especially because when we break it all down to the lowest common denominator, he knew it was going to happen anyway. Right. So how about just a little bit of compassion? How about a little 1 Corinthians 13? How about using love and kindness? How about using kindness? How about what Jesus said? Treat your neighbor as yourself. Right. You wouldn't want those things to be done to you, so you don't want to do them to other people. Right. And what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? Because had they followed that tenet, they wouldn't have done A, B, or C horrible thing in the first place, right? So you can play coulda, woulda, shoulda all day long. But yeah, I guess we're gonna do this on that point too.
Well, and yeah, but I guess let me kind of see if I could potentially. I don't think I'll convince you. Don't get me wrong, but maybe just present a different way of looking at it for sure.
Sure.
So there are a couple things I think that are important to point out. So the first thing is that I think that to an extent, now this is obviously certainly presuppositional, so I won't make this my sole point, but just to an extent, if the arbiter of morality is God, then the wages of sin would be death, precisely because that's just the way that the system was set up. You know what I mean? And it's almost kind of like to say, like, well, is the penalty for killing somebody death? Well, I mean, if the government said so, then yeah, it is. That's just sort of the way it works. You know what I mean? And that's an unfortunate fact of life, but it is a fact of life in regards to the legal system. I don't think it's an unfortunate fact of life in regards to God's system, because I think that God is actually, always just, whereas a government I don't think could be. But nonetheless,
what would it matter if you thought he was just or not?
Well, to an extent, I think that is true. As in other words, as a philosopher, which I do believe all people are inherently. I don't give myself extra credit when I say that, just so people know. But if I put on that cap, that philosopher's cap, right?
Sure.
If the Islamic God is the actual God, there's literally nothing I can do about it. And things like marrying 6-year-olds are just okay because he's the one who invented morality. And there's nothing I can do to stop that. Yeah, you know what I mean?
I don't think that's in the Quran. That's more in the Hadith. I don't think that's in the Quran.
Well, and even so, the point even just being like, so
the writings of the prophet versus the dictated word of Allah when Muhammad took a flight to heaven on a winged horse, which, yeah, that totally happened.
Well, even make up a hypothetical religion, like call it the Sith. You know what I mean? The point just being that, like, if that were true, there would be nothing I could do about it. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I would just be forced to either have my morality not conform with truth, or conform my morality to something that is abhorrent to me. You know what I mean?
Is that right, or is that might is right?
Well, I think there's a couple things to be said on that, honestly. The first thing is that I do think, to an extent, it's not necessarily that might is right, but might certainly does make the rules. You know what I mean?
Oh, sure, yeah. Money isn't everything, but it sure makes life easier.
Exactly, right? It's one of those things where it's like, the United States government is a perfect example, and any government, don't get me wrong, but I just, because I live in the US, you could use the Canadian government for this too. Perfect example. If there's any law of theirs that you don't appreciate, go ahead and not follow it and see what happens. You know what I mean? They are mightier than you.
We can petition to change laws, right?
Don't get me wrong, that's true, but you can't just disobey it. You know what I mean? Like, you can't, in other words,
that's true.
If you were in, I guess weed is becoming decriminalized in a lot of places. So if you were to just go out and, smoke like heroin or something right in front of the police or something like that, just like to protest or whatever, you'd get arrested. You know what I mean? Because they are mightier than you, and you don't have that right because they have decided you don't have that right, at least up until somebody decides to petition to potentially change that. You know what I mean?
Could we petition God to take out adultery from the Ten Commandments?
No, but that's definitely different, because God's laws are, they're like the ultimate standard. In other words, what legal systems attain to get, not with the necessarily the death part, because I don't think humans have the right to take life, and that God has the sole authority to take life. That's a very firm conviction of mine. But nonetheless, I do think his system, both in the moral sense, don't go cheat on your wife and stuff like that, and in the legal sense, murderers should be punished and stuff like that, are the thing that we are to attain to, because it's the ultimate standard, and therefore it wouldn't change. You know what I mean?
Because he said so.
No, that is true. Actually, to an extent, it is true. He created it, and so as a result, he's the one who dictates, what is and is not its function. Now, I'm not strictly divine command theory, meaning that I do think his decisions are based within an inherent nature of his, and therefore they're not arbitrary, right? So, like, for example, I believe that God does not approve of the indiscriminate taking of human life, because he himself does not take life indiscriminately. And of course, I'm sure we would have a back and forth on that, but I would argue that right. The point, I guess, just sort of being that I do believe that is sort of the way that kind of sets up. But the bigger purpose than that I'm trying to kind of get to, and I sort of dance around it with so many other tangents, so I apologize. But if you have something that is pure, right, Purity is kind of a fickle thing. Take a water that is absolutely pure, and even, I mean, you can make it like a infinite pool of water, in a literally infinite pool of water. Like, imagine this hypothetical infinite pool of water, right?
Okay.
And it's all 100% pure. And you drop a milliliter of ink into that infinite pool of water, and it is no longer a infinitely pure pool of water. It has now been tainted, right? Even though it's infinite, and even though it was completely pure to begin with, like, that's just the nature of purity.
Sure. Yeah.
So if God truly is that infinite pool of water, if you will, and is also truly pure, right, then even the slightest infraction would be abhorrent to him. You see what I mean?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
And so then I think it would follow then at that point that, while, don't get me wrong, I don't think that God is actually expecting you to go take your disrespectful child and kill them. I don't think that's what he means by that. But I do think
the Bible does say that you should kill disobedient children.
Right, and I think there are things to be said about the Mosaic law and don't get me wrong, there's a fundamentalist Jewish perspective and a fundamentalist Christian perspective that will slightly differ. I firmly acknowledge that.
Sorry, I keep on derailing you. Please finish your point.
No, you're fine. But the point kind of being that I think the purpose of that isn't to get Micheal to go stone his kid, but the purpose of that is to teach the child, look, from God's perspective, it's just inherent. This is just what we do. And this is why we need saviors in the first place, or a savior, I should say, in the first place, because that's what we are. And then this gets to the second point. You brought up mercy, right? It is interesting. I mean, God's a lot more long-suffering than we are. Think of the Amalekites as our perfect example, right? They attacked the Israelites coming out of Sinai, or Egypt, excuse me, into Sinai, which, if you take just a straightforward reading of the Bible, would be roughly 1446 BC, if it happened, of course, because I understand that you probably wouldn't agree that it happened, but nonetheless. And then when the Amalekites are actually destroyed, which would be sometime in the reign of Saul.
It was like 400 years later.
Yeah, it was almost 400 years later. Now, there are two ways that actually it's over 400 years, because 480 years would be from Solomon's 4th year to the Exodus. So if we just take back 44 years, it's 440 roughly.
Right. That actually makes it worse.
Or, see, there's two ways you can look at that. Because
everyone that had done wrong was already dead.
See, then that's a good point, right? But I think that's why I point out there are two different ways that you can look at this, right? The first way you can look at this is, it seems like God is punishing people for something they did a really long time ago. But I think that's inaccurate if you take the Bible in context, because the second way of looking at this is that the Amalekites did something 400 years ago, and 400 years later have consistently continued to do the same thing, only worse.
Sure. Yeah.
And so it would be kind of similar to, like, if you had a adulterer who was, cheating, and it just continued to happen throughout. I mean, maybe you're just like a ridiculously long-suffering person, and you let this person do this for the next 10, 15 years, and finally you're fed up with it. And maybe when you're finally fed up with it, you actually bring up the very first time, right? That's not because you're actually holding the very first time against them per se. It's that you've now seen a trend of 10, 15 years from that first point on. And it's,
sure, yeah, I get that.
Right?
Yeah.
And we know that the Bible actually teaches this, because when Samuel slays Agag, the king of the Amalekites, what he tells him is, just as you have made the mothers childless, so now will your mother be without child.
Sure.
The implication being, you're a vicious warmonger, and as a result, war has now come upon you, right? Yeah. It's the live by the sword, die by the sword kind of thing. And so,
I get it. Yeah.
In other words, though, to kind of wrap up, right? Well, we don't see here God punishing the Amalekites for something they did 400 years ago, in the sense that he's actually holding that alone against them and they haven't done anything else wrong, right? What we see is God actually mercifully allowing this culture to live despite doing that evil thing. And then finally, after 440 years of constant warmongering and slaying and all this other kind of stuff, says, all right, I'm done. Right.
Right.
And you see, I think in Hosea is a perfect example of that too, because when Samaria is finally destroyed, which Samaria is northern Israel, when the two kingdoms split, it's in 722 BC. Samaria is at no point in time what you would consider a righteous nation from a biblical standpoint. They're basically always not only worshiping the Canaan gods, but the worst of the worst Canaanite gods. They're real, and we actually have archaeological evidence to prove this. They were really into sacrifice.
I'm
all
not
that kind of stuff.
that, yeah.
And it's in 722 BC that the Assyrians finally come and destroy them. When they split from the United Kingdom, when the United Kingdom split Judah and Samaria into two kingdoms, right? That was 200 and let me think. It would be 200 and actually be almost exactly 200 years later. 203. Okay. What's the point? The point is for 203 years, God quite mercifully allowed Samaria to move on with their life, constantly warning them through prophet after prophet after prophet after prophet, right? And they continue on with the child sacrifice, with the warmongering, with the temple prostitution, which is basically overglorified sexual slavery. And finally, at a certain point in time, says, all right, we're done here, right? That to me seems like incredibly long-suffering mercy rather than holding things against people that they did a very long time ago. You know what I mean?
Oh, no, I get that. But the hard part and where I keep getting hung up on is, you said that, that God suffered, right? Before, he's, however you want to say, the whole thing started up, snapped his finger, blinked his eye, twitched his ear, whatever you want to say. He already knew it was going to happen. Right. That's like, I bet you if I run really fast at that wall head first, it's going to hurt, and then do it and then complain about how much it hurt when you hit the wall. It didn't have to be that. None of it had to be that way. It is whatever we're dealing with now. Absolutely everything. You've complained before about the room that you do your show in is hot.
Right.
God knew about that before the universe started. He knew you were going to be uncomfortable in that shirt. Right? He's not to toss out the idea of him suffering because of people doing something that he already knew he was going to do in the first place. Right? It just seems silly to me. It's like, well, I put up with it as long as I can. I've known about it for an infinite amount of time because I'm outside of time and space, and I live currently in the past, present, and future. So I've always known this is going to happen, and I'm really upset by it.
Well, and I think there's a lot of theology to be said about that for sure. So I'll try to make this incredibly pithy. But what I would say is just twofold brief. First one, I don't think that it is kind of like bringing up the author example again, right? Even though it may be the intentions of the author to have an antagonist, it is also still the intentions of the author to have the antagonist viewed in a evil light and get their comeuppance, usually, sure. Right? And so I guess I don't necessarily see contradiction in that per se, and that I do take God in a sense as like a divine author. Right. Not 100%. I am a compatibilist, so I don't think that everything is necessarily predetermined in that sense, but it is predetermined in some sense. And it's just hard for me to understand why, if I'm being honest, or how, if I'm being honest, rather. But that's honest. I accept that. Oh, I appreciate that, actually. The second thing, though, that I think I would say is that I do think the Bible does present for us God operating within creation and within time, right? In fact, I would even argue that it seems to me that one of the biggest differences in father and son distinction is that we typically only ever see the father referenced in an eternal sense and the son referenced in a temporal sense. That's not 100% true. Don't get me wrong. But most of the time it's true. And so, for example, when John says nobody has seen the Father at any time, the only begotten of the Father, he has made him known. The word actually there is the root word for exegete. That implies there then when you see Moses speaking to God, or God walking with Enoch, or God talking to Abraham at the Oaks of Mamre and all that, if the story is all, of course, consistent and true, then that would actually all be the Son and not the Father, right? Now, obviously, there's a lot of theology to go in there.
I've heard that argument before, because there's one of the tropes commonly tossed out, or not commonly, one of the tropes tossed out by some atheists are there are two contradicting Bible verses, one that says no one has ever seen the face of God, and one that says, I have seen the face of God, yet I'm spared. And some atheists will say, look, it's a contradiction. And I've heard the apologetic that you just used as an explanation for that it wasn't really the Father, because there's only a couple of cases that I'm familiar with in the Bible that kind of anthropomorphizes God the Father. But Jesus is like flesh and blood dude, right? So it's easier. And I guess from some perspective, like from the Christian perspective, yeah, that makes total sense. Like if you're looking at the Godhead, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, then it's just like, yeah, it's the Son, who's still really me anyway, but the Son, then that makes sense, right? If that's how you interpret that from your worldview perspective, it makes perfect sense.
Well, and I do appreciate the kind of honesty there, because I do think it does make it a little bit, because one thing that's important to note about that particular apologetic is it's actually it's a Bible verse itself. Which, by the way, I don't say that to say that, I take no offense to the term apologetic. It literally comes from the Greek used in the Bible. Yeah. So I don't say it like that. But I just say it to point out, it's interesting. John himself in John 1:18 actually used the apologetic, saying, no man has seen the Father at any time, or no man has seen God at any time. The only begotten of the Father, he's made him known. So, which of course, obviously, there's the, a Jewish perspective might have a little bit of a different opinion on that, because they wouldn't accept John as scripture. But nonetheless, it does seem to me to show that there is a operation of God that works within creation. It's the self same God, but that has worked within our own creation, and from the beginning, even. In fact, going back to John again, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then it moves on to say, without him, nothing was made that was made. And other verses point out that it's like the God basically makes through his word.
Sure, yeah.
Like I said, there's a whole lot of theology to get on there. So I don't.
And you touched on a little bit there, like the fact that there's a little bit of presuppositionalism going in there. And again, like if you, from the Christian perspective, everything you said makes total sense. Of the people that may or may still not be in the live chat, they're saying, praise CJ, preach, all those things, because they're looking at it from the same perspective. And so it totally makes sense. How come this dumb atheist can't see it? It's so simple. Why can't he just understand this stuff? I get it from your perspective, from the Christian worldview. Nothing you have said is inconsistent. If this God is omnipotent, he can both exist in creation and be outside attending my funeral. That's child's play for an omnipotent being, right? So okay.
Well, so then could you then see though then how it would be possible for God to have an actual patience at that point, and also an actual feeling of not just the long suffering, which is just patience and mercy, but also actual suffering, like even grievance.
I understand what you're saying. That's harder to reconcile with, like, okay, I have to humanize it. It's the only way. It's all I have the capacity to do. Everyone, I think it's probably fair to say that everyone has probably done something that ahead of time they knew probably wasn't going to work out the way they wanted it to, but they did it anyway.
Right.
And when it happened, they're like, I knew this was going to happen, but they still did it. And they may feel some sorrow or regret or something like that, as a result. So from a humanized perspective, yes. However, myself or anyone else who's maybe done that I hope people in the live chat are honest enough to be able to have an introspective look and admit to themselves that they've probably done the same thing. But what they don't have is 100% foreknowledge of the outcome already. And that's why it's harder to reconcile what it is you're saying. Because did I know that it wasn't going to work out? No. It could have actually worked out. I could have put my last $50 on the craps tables. Man, I'm not going to roll a 7. Boom, 7. Woohoo! But I didn't know that was going to happen. Or I crap out. Oh, I didn't know that was going to happen. I had a pretty good idea because the odds are not in your favor in situations like that. But as God holds those cosmic dice in his hands, he already knows exactly what's going to come up. He knew before he put the dice in his hands. And that's why it's harder to reconcile. Like, I understand from your perspective, but I think that's perhaps the Christian, or I won't lay it on everybody, but for you, are anthropomorphizing God and looking at it from your perspective, thinking, I get it. Because if I was in that situation, I'd feel the same way.
Well, and I do think there's certainly some level of truth to that. And I also think, of course, obviously, that there'd be some level of pushback. I think the biggest thing where I would want to push back is just simply to say that I do believe it does seem as if God actually reveals himself to be like that. In other words, while it could be an anthropomorphization, it does come from God himself, assuming that he is an existent being.
Oh, sure. If part of his decretive whatever is like, but you said there's also a nature, right? So, I mean, all anyone can do, including you, I think, and any believer of any faith tradition, if you're going to look at it honestly, all you can do is speculate as to what, because I mean, the Bible tells a lot of stories and we interpret those stories. And I think a lot of apologists and Christians and things like that have assembled to what they believe is here. I've read and I've studied a lot and I've looked at all the different languages and stuff. And so I think I've got a pretty good idea on what God's nature is. And I've kind of put it into this thing here. So this is God's nature. If you're going to prescribe the necessary component in order to have that anthropomorphized emotion or feeling, if you're going to prescribe that to the nature in advance, okay, sure. And then it makes total sense. If you're prepared to make that leap, and you can say the same thing about from the justice perspective. He waited 400 years and then finally got pissed off enough that was it. Right? Even though all the prophets were going down and saying, look, it basically, I don't know if you're old enough to remember that cartoon, Wait Till Your Father Gets Home. But it was basically this kind of neutered mother with a bunch of kids running around doing dumb stuff. And the whole theme song of the cartoon was Wait Till Your Father Gets Home. And the subtext was, you're going to get it when your father gets home. So, so here's all these prophets saying all these things, and then God, because we've kind of determined or we've attributed this nature to him based on our own thoughts and feelings and interpretations of the things that we read, to have this piece in his nature, boom, makes total sense.
Well, so the one thing I would want to, I think, ask in this situation, because I do think it's an interesting point. Obviously, the only thing that I do have, unfortunately, is another human example in this example. But
that's all we have, CJ, and that's right. At least honest. It's at least honest to say all we can do is humanize this, because it's really all we have.
It's true, right? I mean, the only thing that would be different is potentially like fictionalize it in the form of parable. You know what I mean? But that's obviously not too much different, really.
I appreciate the human example much more.
Right, I agree, actually. So, we do know that authors, regardless of whether it's a book or a play or a movie or even an artist painting something, right, whatever it is, the creators, I guess we could even say, right? They have a very emotional attachment to their creation. And the Bible does present us being made in the image of God. Now, of course, one could argue what exactly that means. And I think there is certain elements of our nature that are contradictory to what the Bible presents as God's nature, at least arguably. But this seemingly doesn't seem to be one of them, and in fact, it seems to be something that we even directly, what would be the word there? Attribute, or not attribute. There's a word. We get it from God, is what it seems to be.
Inherit?
Bible, yeah, inherit. There you go. Thank you. It seems to be a trait that we inherit from God himself, as far as like having this extreme emotional attachment to our own creations. And none of this is exemplified more so than our living creations, right? Namely children.
Sure.
But even things that we don't necessarily, have any sort of an attachment to, like that, like your architecture, if you're an architect, or your writing or something like that, right? These things, I think, show us even that there is this like extreme attachment that almost borders on somewhat irrational to one's own creations. And while I wouldn't attribute anything irrational to God in that sense, I do think that it would be safe to say that God would have the same. But I would assume that you think being all-knowing would create some kind of a problem with that. Is that accurate?
It doesn't seem, and this could be a flaw with me. It doesn't seem particularly rational for, like I said, whatever analogy you want to use. It's really going to hurt when I run headfirst into that wall. It doesn't seem particularly rational for a being with 100% foreknowledge to be able to experience that type of humanized emotion. In Genesis, it says that God regretted creating before the flood story. It says that God looked at him, he regretted creating man. It's like, could have had a V8 and needed to etch a sketch it all and start over again. So it's, but I think that again, that's again a story with with something basically being attributed to, right? I'm going to prescribe this onto this deity. And you know what? If the whole story is true, if everything about it is true, then you could simply say, all of this is orchestrated in a way so that it's meaningful to us. Because we understand when somebody reads, he was troubled by this, or he was upset by this, or he regrets this. We understand those human emotions, or at least most of us do. And it makes the story easier for us to understand. That seems more likely.
Well, it does seem to me, too, that not only does it allow for that, but it also does, at least seemingly, like I said, it does seem to me like, God operating within creation does almost allow himself to experience those real time even, too. And even more so when he actually becomes incarnate, right? Because Jesus is literally nailed to a cross, meaning that God literally experienced human torture. That's an interesting thing to think of. In fact, it's kind of a mind boggler in a way. But the point being that if God is capable of manifesting himself in those, within creation, in totem, and then also within our physical reality as far as being a person,
sure,
right? Then it does seem to me that he would absolutely not only, be able to communicate these things to us in a way we understood, but actually legitimately feel them. You know what I mean?
If the things you just said are true, yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, it is actually interesting. We got in a lot of that, and now we're up here almost to 2 hours. We didn't actually get to the punishment aspect of Hosea 13 itself too much, at least. I did bring up the purity example, but that was sort of as far as we got on that.
Right. CJ, I hate to do this to you, but could I ask you to hold on for just 1 second? And
absolutely.
You could maybe plug the debate.
Yeah, for sure. So real quick, in fact, I'll acknowledge some people I'll go ahead and plug the debate, and then I'll acknowledge some of the people here in the live chat and all that. So me and Michael will be debating on the question of, are the 10 commandments ethical? The conversation is going to be had on May the 13th, which is this Thursday, on Standing for Truth's channel. And in fact, I'll even go ahead and throw the link in the live chat for you guys. It's the first time I've ever actually done a debate on Standing for Truth's channel, so that's going to be pretty cool. And it's also sort of a long time coming because me and Michael have been wanting to set this up since our first conversation. But it's going to be about 1 o'clock Mountain Time, which is, of course, my time. If you're on the East Coast, it's going to be 3 o'clock your time. I just actually got that thrown into the live chat, so you guys can go ahead and check that out if you would like to.
I do.
Yeah, that'll definitely be a lot of fun. Again, the topic is, are the 10 Commandments ethical? And I think that'll be a very interesting conversation, especially considering, what is, I guess, been sort of the theme of this channel recently. It's been a combination of Old Testament history and really difficult passages in the Bible. So the both of those sort of coincide with the 10 Commandments in a way.
I actually can't wait for that. That's gonna be a really good time. And I've not interacted with Standing for Truth before, so I'm looking forward to it. Yeah,
I think it'll be a good conversation too. I think I'm very. I haven't had. Now it's funny. I say I haven't had a debate in a while, but it's only been like 2 or 3 weeks. It's just I was doing debates so frequently for a while that now feels like it's been a while.
It's been an eternity.
Right.
Yeah. So we should. I think this kind of organically, finishing up a couple of points has come to a good place, and I'm totally into like unpausing this at another time and continuing where we left off. Because I think that one thing you and I have demonstrated the ability to do is have a discussion without it devolving into just arguments and ad hominems.
Yeah, absolutely, and I absolutely appreciate that. In fact, it's the big portion of the reason why I do enjoy having these conversations with you in particular. And there, not to say that there's not other atheists who are like that. I don't want to just trash all the whole atheist people, but it's just something that I like to see. So whenever I do see it, I acknowledge it, kind of thing, Real quick, I just said Kelvin Quayo points out, he says evilbible.org was pretty much my homepage first year after becoming a Christian. It's funny that you bring that up, Kelvin, because that is essentially the catalyst in a way for a lot of the stuff that I've ended up arguing over the past couple of months. So anyways, this is a pretty
good one. Another good one is why won't God heal amputees.com.
I actually have some interesting comments on that, but I'll go ahead and save those for another episode.
Anyway, if you want to wrap up, I'll let you do whatever you want to do to wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I will say here is a couple things. First thing, we did manage to speak a little bit about Job and a little bit about Hosea 13 today. If you guys enjoyed the conversation, please remember to like, please remember to share, please remember to subscribe if you have not done so. We are actually only 2 subscribers away from 400, so that'll be kind of nice. 400 is not one of the milestones that I personally have. I like to go by tens, so it's 100, and then my next one is 1,000. But nonetheless, 400 is still cool to hit. So if you guys want to help us try and hit 400, definitely do that. I appreciate it. And again, if you guys like this conversation, please do like and share it. What good is a message without an audience to hear it? If you, like I said, want to contribute to us and you already subscribe and you feel like I am actually deserving of it, I do have a Patreon and I do aim on making this a career. If you think that I am worthy of making this a career, please consider giving. Only give if you feel led. There is nothing that I have to give you if you give. Right now, it is just simply something that is from your own personal feeling. So don't feel any sort of pressures or anything like that, right? Or like there's going to be some special status afforded or anything like that either, which is sort of the bad thing. But nonetheless, appreciate you guys if you do want to do that. The best thing you can do for these videos is watch as much of it as possible. That is the thing which boosts it through the algorithm, more so than likes, more so than shares, more so than even just being here with the one view and then leaving. So I appreciate you guys doing that. And that's everything. Like, share, subscribe, Patreon, watch it all. Yeah. Thank you guys very much. Shalom. God bless you. We will be back here in another episode soon if the Lord tarries. And yeah.
Cheers, everybody.